Okay, everyone. So it's the second lecture of week 7, and what I want this lecture to be centered upon is, of course, the coming of the Civil War and why slavery was really the key to the whole discussion. So one thing that I think in regards to our world today, as we are still, of course, talking about the Civil War, you hear sometimes a argument that, of course, slavery was sometimes a secondary or even less so cause of the Civil War, and this is just absurd from the historian standpoint. Slavery is always at the heart of the discussion, even when you see, of course, discussions about, say, American expansionism, the power of sectionalism in terms of the North versus the South, or states' rights questions. These are always centered around, of course, the question of slavery. So, to put things simply here, the first thing that we need to look at is this expansion to the West and how these different states were formed. So, of course, when you had the 13 colonies on the eastern coast, and eventually by the end of the Revolutionary War at the turn of the 19th century, those colonies moving farther to the west past the Appalachians and into what was called the Old Northwest, what we would call the Great Lakes states today. You saw this expansion up into about the Mississippi River. This was sparsely populated, to say the least, and of course, most of the states like Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Mississippi, Alabama, these all come into the Union not until the 18 teens and 1820s. From the west of the Mississippi River, of course, most famously in 1803, you have the Louisiana Purchase, in which the Jefferson White House bought from France, doubling the size of the United States. In doing so, what you got, of course, was all of this new land as Native Americans were slowly pushed further and further to the west. As I mentioned in my last lecture, of course, what was found is that slavery became incredibly profitable as the West expanded. And this largely had to do, of course, with the growth of cotton in this Black Belt area here of Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and West Texas. This was kind of the heart of the slave empire. Where cotton was absolutely king. And of course, as this kept moving west, slavery kind of moved with it. The Old Northwest, right here, where Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan were, had come in 1787 as a territory, and at that time it was slavery was made to be not allowed in those states. And so you quickly got the situation where south of what was known as the Mason-Dixon line were slave states, and north of it were pretty much mostly free at that point by the time of the beginning of the 19th century. The question became quickly, as new states started to want to come in and the expansion started to move further west, was how is it that these states, what are they going to come in as? Are they going to come in as slave states? Are they going to come in as free states? What is going to be the decision that's made? The first compromise, of course, that's made is called the Missouri Compromise in 1820, in which the state of Missouri wants to come in. And of course, slaves had been brought there from Kentucky and Tennessee and Mississippi, moving farther to the west into Missouri, and slavery was already existent there. So it was wanting to come in as a slave state. What the northern states are now starting to get worried of is as these slave states keep coming in, if you keep having this, what you're going to have is perhaps they will not be as populated because it's pretty quickly noticed that the northern states are going to be more populated than the southern states. But in the Senate, you're going to have, and with the Electoral College, a advantage to slave states very specifically, and of course, then you're going to have an advantage in the courts as well. Um, and so the North and South come to this compromise where Missouri will come in as a slave state, Maine will come in as a free state, and from that point on, you have kind of a shared understanding that one slave will equal one free state, and the slave states will be only south of this dividing line, the southern border of Missouri. North of it will be free, south of it will be slave. for whatever states come in from the future. This was thought to be something that would work for the future of the country. The next big step in regards to this expansion actually comes to the question of what's going to happen with Texas. Texas was owned by Mexico. It was opened up to American settlers to come and farm with the understanding that they would not bring slaves. This was not the case, though. As Americans started to spread into Texas, they always brought their slaves with them, and this led to a showdown with the Mexican government, leading, of course, to the famous fight for Texas independence. The idea that the Texas independence fighters had was that they would, of course, join the United States Union. This was seen as being a problem, though, for numerous reasons. One, because the question was how many states will be in Texas? Will this add a huge number of slave states where free states can't come in? And two, it would, of course, cause to the question of what would be the purpose of fighting for Texas independence. Is it for adding to the slave opportunities of the southern states? And what would be the fight for? So this was thought to be something that was better to be simply avoided, where the Congress and president would just kind of avoid this, turn the other way, help out when possible. But Texas, of course, becomes independent for roughly a decade after the 1836 victory over Mexico. With the changes in Washington, D.C., you start to see a larger growth of sectionalism, where southern states start to identify themselves not based on the political party that they're a part of, the individuals within those states, but by where they live. So in other words, you get the sense that if you live in Tennessee, you have to see yourself as being opposite from people who live in Michigan. The North and the South is getting more and more separated. They're voting in Washington more and more in the 1840s based upon sectional identity and not political identity. So to put it simply, imagine today, we of course have red states and blue states, but if you had a situation in which a blue state, everybody in that state saw themselves as one identity against everybody in a red state, and those of course were sectionally grouped together, you could imagine this is of course being a big problem in regards to what the future of the country would be about. Texas annexation took place in 1845 and 1846, where a new government in Washington, D.C., led by James K. Polk, promised to annex Texas, and in so doing really made a lot of Northerners upset. This was thought to be done very particularly for slave interests. And now Northerners were starting to be worried that the government of the United States was working for these slave interests. Now, Northerners were not interested in ending slavery for moral ends. Abolitionists were, of course, but they were a tiny minority. Most Northerners just saw this simply as a threat to their economic well-being. If they kept moving west with slavery, as it kept moving farther and farther west, it meant less land for free white landowners to own. So many Northerners were against the annexation of Texas. Nonetheless, it did occur, leading to a war with Mexico, in which the United States ended up coming in as the winner in 1848. One kind of unknown Pennsylvania congressperson named David Wilmot basically raised in Congress the idea that any lands that were taken in the victory over Mexico should actually stay, if not free, then based upon the concept of popular sovereignty. In other words, the states would decide themselves if they wanted slavery. This, of course, went against what the Missouri Compromise had said, and it really made a lot of slave owners upset. Because, of course, the idea was, well, what if Arizona, a new state that wants to come in perhaps at some point, decides that they don't want to have slavery? Because the majority of people, 51%, decide that they want to be a free state. Well, slave owners, their notion was they needed to keep moving west and transporting slavery farther west for slavery to exist and to keep making money from it. This was the only way this was possible. So what the slave owners of the South started to see was perhaps we're starting to see a northern conspiracy against the slave interests. They're looking to destroy slavery, actually. At the same time that this is occurring, you of course have the political system really and party system breaking up, and The Democratic Party stays the party of the traditional friends of the slave owners, whereas the different party that starts to form is the Republican Party in the 1850s, that starts to talk about not necessarily ending slavery, but at the very least making sure that it can't keep expanding further and further to the west, kind of putting a cordon around it so that slavery couldn't keep expanding further to the west. The reason they did this, again, was not because they were believers in the equality of man or that slavery was necessarily immoral. The reason most Republicans were against the spread of slavery was because they were worried that if this happened, it would hurt white working people who might want to buy the land and work it as free people who couldn't afford slaves. So what the Republican Party's first stance was very simply on the rallying cry: free labor, free land, free men. And again, this was not a moral outcry against slavery. It was just about the interest of white workers and farmers. However, in the South, this was understood as being a party that, at its very least, was dangerous to the future of slavery. And as we saw with the formation of the cotton economy, slave owning was becoming an incredible moneymaker. To be the richest men in the United States prior to the Civil War were big plantation owners. To put this into to context of how much money was invested in slavery, all of the railroads, factories, and banks combined of the North did not weigh up to as much wealth, as much worth as all of the slaves, the 4 million people enslaved in the South. They were worth billions of dollars. And so the ending of slavery would really be the destruction of an economic system, a system of labor, and of course a social system as well. And for the South, this was understood as being an existential threat, where the Republican Party was trying to, at the very least, slow down the spread of slavery. The Republicans came onto the scene in 1854. They did incredibly well in 1856 for a new party, winning a great number of northern states. By 1857, the Republicans are starting to get very concerned because the Supreme Court seems to be on the side of the slave owners. The Supreme Court in 1857 decided the infamous Dred Scott decision, in which Dred Scott, a man suing for his freedom, a person who had been enslaved, his quote unquote master had taken Dred Scott to a free state to live on a military base for a certain amount of time. Dred Scott said, I believe it was Minnesota, Dred Scott said, I should be free because I have been living in this free state. He took his case to the courts. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice, Roger B. Taney, a Maryland slave owner himself, basically read the Dred Scott decision as an opportunity to end all the controversy around slavery on the side of the slave owners. Roger B. Taney wrote the decision in which he said very famously that no black man had any rights that a white man need take account of. And so basically he said that African Americans not only could be enslaved and transported all over the country, no matter what, North or South. He also said that this was the law of the land, and African Americans could not have any equal civil rights in the United States. This was a radical ruling in which Republicans saw this as the possibility of the beginnings of the slave power, as they called them, the conspiracy about slave owners' desire to take over the whole country. The Dred Scott decision seemed to make it okay to bring slaves anywhere in the country and not to stop and allow slave owners from going anywhere to the west. So with this, many Northerners now started to be very, very concerned. With the John Brown raid into Harper's Ferry, of course, then we see that the South starts to view the North as completely intractable and violent. These conspiracies lead to misunderstandings and a desire to, even for some, to break apart the Union, as they see it as not being possible to stick together. In 1860, of course, Abraham Lincoln, a seemingly moderate Republican, who has spoken out actually for white supremacy in 1858, but also talks about how he hates slavery as an institution, is elected president on the Republican ticket, the first Republican president that there would be. And for the South, this was a sign that the Union needed to be broken up. South Carolina is the first that says we will not be a part of a union in which the Republican president is threatening our ability to hold slaves. They saw Lincoln as a Trojan horse, somebody that once he got into the White House would attempt to destroy slavery. And so they said, we are preemptively going to step out of the Union. And of course, that's what they did, leading to the crisis that would cause the Civil War.